think, Trevor, this is the heart and maybe the most important thing that I've learned as far as how do we actually physically become healthy? Because if we have a part of ourselves that we're ashamed of, or we don't like, or we talked briefly before we got on here about how, trauma, childhood abuse, those kinds of things can frame someone's journey. And if we have parts that we haven't dealt with, they're going to act up almost like children and cause problems. And it's interesting, the prototype of breast cancer, again, some of Peter Levine's and Gabor Mate's work talks about this over-nurturing personality, because our breasts are a nurturing organ to the world and to children. And it's almost like a metaphor for that. You nurture, you care for, you love people, but you're not taking care of yourself. And so at this core of resilience is, what do you need in a healthy way? How can you supply that and be allowed to ask for that? Because those things actually heal autoimmunity.
Welcome to the Woman's Doctor podcast, helping empower women to embrace their body and soul's full potential. I'm your host, Dr. Trevor Cates, and after 22 years of working with patients, I found the answers to our health struggles are much deeper than most people realize. To help explore this, I'm interviewing colleagues and other wellness experts to get to the root cause so women can realize their true beauty and be informed decision makers for themselves and their loved ones. Has there been a time in your life when you felt alone and unsure where to turn for answers? It may have come with the diagnosis of a life-threatening illness, the loss of a job, a death of a loved one, or another circumstance that threatened to change everything you know to be true in your life. Life can bring unexpected challenges. So on today's episode of the Woman's Doctor podcast, we're discussing how to prepare for these, which can actually make us stronger, giving us resilience and purpose. And my guest today is all about this. Dr. Jill Carnahan is a board-certified integrative holistic medicine specialist, functional medicine expert, mold expert, and a survivor of breast cancer and Crohn's disease. Dr. Jill's raw and honest account of her own challenges in facing a life-threatening illness, living with autoimmunity and mold toxicity, and working in a medical system that has no tolerance for stepping outside the lines, offers a path of empowerment for taking control of our own health and well-being. In this interview, we discuss trauma, healing, and recovery, and practical tips for those seeking solutions to long-term chronic illness. This and much more on today's episode of the Woman's Doctor podcast. Jill, it's so great to have you on the podcast. Welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here with you.
You have so much going on right now, and I'm so excited to dive into today's topic around resilience. And I think we could all use some inspiration and guidance on resilience. So, but you've been through a lot that's gotten you to this place. So will you share with everyone your story and why this is such an important topic for you?
Yeah, so I didn't realize it when it first started happening, but when I was 25 years old in third year in my medical training, I found a lump in my breast. And at 25, you don't think of anything serious. You're like, I'm busy. I don't have time to deal with this. But at the urging of several friends and family members, I went and got it checked out. And within 2 weeks, I was in surgery for a biopsy. And then I got a call from my doctor, and she said, Jill, you have aggressive breast cancer. Like, boom. My life kind of stopped in a way, definitely shifted, because here I am, just young, overall healthy. It's funny because looking back, there was little things like I started getting more tired when I was swimming laps. All of a sudden I got a cold sore. I'd never had a cold sore. And it was like a huge cold sore on my face. So my immune system was starting to give me a little clue. And of course, medical education, as you know, is crazy. And that was before work hour regulation. So I was in the midst of like sometimes 36-hour shifts. And it's kind of a brutal caste system. I don't think a lot of people who haven't been through it understand. It's changed slowly, but it's very paternalistic, very, just do or die. There's not a lot of sensitivity. There's not a lot of taking care of yourself. There's none of that mentality. It's like you don't even share if you're sick and you go to work. It's kind of this opposite thing. And then the crazy hours were just insane, like 80, 100-hour work weeks, or, overnight. Sometimes, like I said, you'd work 36 hours. So that set me up, because what I didn't realize was I was this highly sensitive person, which is a gift and a curse. The gift is you see details, you're really sensitive to the environment, you're sensitive to other people's emotions. But in a brutal system like that, you're extra sensitive to all that stress and pressure. And I think I was trying to be tough and strong. I grew up on a farm with this mentality of like pull up by your bootstraps. Like I had resilience built in. I had this like German Swiss heritage, but what I didn't realize was I wasn't really being authentic to myself, which was I need rest. I need good food. I need to be kind to myself. And I wasn't. I was just like, shut up, do the work. Right. And I'm saying that because this is part of resilience and part of, I believe, what led to my breast cancer at 25. I think some of the other things were growing up on a farm. I was exposed to estrogen disruptors. So those organophosphates and chemicals and well water and all kinds of things. And I probably got exposure. And that led to a very early diagnosis of aggressive breast cancer. So that was my very first lesson. And I wasn't quite aware of my life and my soul's journey, but it very quickly, first, it was kind of a shock. I took off medical school. I really ended up doing very conventional, aggressive. I did 3 drug chemotherapy. I did radiation. I did surgery, multiple surgeries. And I did that because I was in a battle for my life. And I remember I was in a group of young women and they considered under 40 young for breast cancer. And I think there was, 8 or 10 of us. And Trevor, I'm the only one still living of that group. So it kind of shows you how deadly that disease is. So my lesson, the first lesson, I remember pretty early on getting kind of a meditative time where I felt, you know what, I'm going to get through this. I just know it. We talked earlier, this call about sometimes we have that knowing about our future, about a vision of what we might see. And I had this deep sense of like, I'm going to survive. But I also had a sense of I need to be aware because something important in this process is going to be a lesson to me. Like if I have to go through something that's suffering and painful, there's got to be something good here. And I'm going to find it if I have to, almost die. I'm going to find it. So I really came in with that mentality, but I didn't really understand how much that's a part of resilience. And what it is we all have really tough, bad things happen, whether it's a loved one dying or with COVID, there was all kinds of trauma and different things, or finances or a moldy home, which we all know about. But these things can be really, really difficult and they're not easy and we do suffer. But if we can, during that suffering, during that time, still remember that there's something important, that our soul's journey has a purpose and that there's meaning in the suffering. Actually, sometimes there's the most meaning in the darkest times. It's hard to grasp. That's the core of resilience. And I remember in breast cancer, it was just like training wheels for me, starting to understand, starting to look. Now I look back, Trevor, and it's literally like I could cry because there's no doubt that story, that experience set me up for success as a doctor. Like there could have been no better marketing plan, which I hate marketing, right? And it wasn't in that way, but the truth is my experience set me up to be a very compassionate, understanding, and know things at a level that medical training could have never taught me. How it feels to be pulled back in a gurney to surgery, say goodbye to your family and not sure if you're going to come out or not, or just those types of things. You never can teach that in a textbook. So I got a training that was on a whole different level through breast cancer. And I get done with that about a year later, start going back to classes. I took 9 months off for treatment. And I thought, okay, I'm ready to go back. Once again, I was still in the mindset of suppressing my fatigue, suppressing my emotions, suppressing my fears, suppressing my pain, and just being tough and strong. And again, that's really not the definition of resilience, but I tried, went back. And what's funny is I went back, I started having cyclical fevers. I mean, I was working in the ER and I was getting fevers up to 101, 102. Like I was sick. I was so malnourished from the chemo. I was bald. I had no hair. I mean, if anyone would have realistically looked at me, they would have said, Jill, take care of yourself, take a little bit more time off. But I didn't have that understanding. All I had was like, I have to be tough. I have to be strong. I can't fail. I have to show the world I can do this, right? And again, that was coming from this heritage that's beautiful. It was very strong work ethic, but also hurts our souls and hurts our inner little girls and hurts the women that we are, because we are created to have love and laughter and creativity and play and sleep and good food and time with friends. And I didn't understand that. I just went right back to work because that's the only thing I knew. And you and I also talked earlier about how I grew up and I haven't really done a lot of drugs or alcohol. So in addiction world, I'm like, oh, I'm not an addict. But there was one point in my life when someone said, hey, you who are working as hard as you are, as much hours as you are, that's an addiction. And it was a shift in my mindset. And I thought, oh, he's right. This is part of my covering up pain. And then back to my story with going right back into rotations was all I knew to cover up pain and suffering was go work, go produce. And also that was the way I got value, because if I was producing, if I was successful, I got accolades, people loved me, right? And somehow I got confused and I thought, oh, I'm only lovable if I work hard, if I produce a lot, if I'm successful. And it got confused, my message. And so I was thinking, I'm only valuable if I go back to work and finish medical school. And in that month, 6 months after I was diagnosed with breast cancer, I had a fever when I actually passed out in the ER while I was taking a patient's blood pressure, cold on the floor. So I knew something was wrong and I couldn't ignore it. And I went that night to the resident on call, and I was immediately admitted to surgery for an abscess that had perforated in my gut. And that was the diagnosis of Crohn's. So I woke up in the morning to the surgeon telling me, Jill, you have Crohn's disease. So looking back, it kind of makes sense because I had a drug from chemotherapy that caused leaky gut. Leaky gut is one of those things that can be the trigger for someone who already has genetics for Crohn's. Crohn's is an autoimmune disease, if you don't know about this, that attacks your gut lining, causes real bad inflammation, malnutrition, weight loss, pain, fatigue. So I went right from breast cancer to Crohn's. And in all of this, the other piece that was a common thread of resilience was, I have to figure this out. I have to figure out what to do to survive. And I left my gastroenterologist after just hearing I had Crohn's. And I had asked him right before I left, I said, Doc, is there anything I could do, like with diet? Is there anything that diet can do? And he said, Jill, diet has nothing to do with this. So I was like, wait, that can't be right. And I started kind of on a trajectory to learn about the gut and learn how to fix this, because I didn't know about Crohn's. I thought, he told me it's irreversible. You're going to have lifelong drugs, immune modulating drugs, steroids right now. You're probably going to have colon resected at some point in your life. I mean, he was pretty grim. And I was like, that can't be right. Surely I can fix this. And then that kept me on this journey of healing the gut. And over the next several weeks, as I changed my diet, got rid of gluten, got rid of inflammatory foods, my symptoms literally went away. And it took me a couple of years to heal from Crohn's. But in that journey, once again, I learned so much about resilience.
Wow, that's amazing. So this is about redefining resilience, because I think there is this sort of misunderstanding of what resilience means. I think it's, but so let's kind of do a recap on that. What do you feel like we need to move away from with this myth of what resilience maybe we believed it meant? And then what is it that we really want to embrace resilience as meaning?
I love that because, at least for me, I was born in 76 and then grew up in the 80s, and there was a lot of masculinizing women, and nothing wrong with that. We all have masculine and feminine sides, right? We want to embrace both. But what we did is we swung from our feminine side into this, at least for me, I'll just speak for myself. And especially in a medical world, the medical world is extremely masculine. It's driven by agenda and drive and details and production and analytical thinking, which is left brain. Again, nothing wrong with these things. We need them both. But I went full swing into that analytical. I did bioengineering back undergrad, and then I went into medical school. And once again, like there was no idea that I could take time off when I was sick. I mean, I did for the chemo, but then as soon as I was done, I went right back to school, because that drive, that production, that agenda, that to-do list, that was the thing. And I remember even when I first started speaking, I wore black pantsuits. I mean, that's not me at all, black pantsuits. And I look back, I'm like, who was that? She was trying to be something she wasn't. So when you talk about definition of resilience, it is not just, covering up your pain and showing up and doing the work. That's not resilience. This more feminine definition of resilience is actually allowing ourselves rest and creativity and time with friends and all of these things that nourish our souls that maybe aren't productive, right? That aren't like in the standard world. And I had to really unlearn that, because when first time I started to sit still and either meditate or journal or coloring was something that transformed my life into that more feminine creative, or, start to play music or these things that are more creative. I felt unproductive. I thought in my mind, I'm like, I should be doing my work. I should be doing something productive, or just spending time with friends and hours without really thinking about the time. That was hard for me. So this definition of resilience now all of a sudden goes from just production and overcoming and stuffing your emotions, which is a very masculine definition, to this feminine definition is, I would say, be kind to yourself. What does your soul need? And like checking in and saying, oh, maybe I feel like I should be doing this work, but maybe I need a hike in nature with my dog with no agenda and with headphones with music or with a friend, or I love to go coloring with friends. And I literally will ask them out for coffee, but in my Lexus, I have a little bag of coloring books. And somebody pull it out and say, hey, you want to color? And every once in a while, my friends know me now. Every once in a while, they're kind of, but if that before they did, or people who don't know me, they're kind of look like, okay, whatever. But you know what happens when I bring out that coloring book? All of a sudden, there's this deeper connection. It almost brings out that childlike side, which is just innocent, authentic, like how we were when we were children. We didn't worry about what people thought. And we dreamed so big, Trevor. Like, think about when you were 5, you thought you could fly. You thought you could be a unicorn. You thought you could be a princess. Those things, and they were real. They were like, oh, I can, do, or you watch a movie and you're like, oh my gosh, that was real. And it was some fantasy about unicorns and princesses. And so that blurring of reality is actually our best way to, number one, become resilient as adults. Number two, in embrace our creativity, which allows us to show up in the world with vibrancy and love and laughter. But we've lost that. We've lost that as we've grown because someone told us, oh, that's stupid. That's not real. Santa Claus isn't real. All these things, that we had. And I'm not saying we should believe in make-believe, but I'm saying the way we dream and vision and create and embrace that feminine side and become resilient is by being curious and actually becoming more like we were when we were 5 than we're 30, right?
Yeah, I love all of that. And so what have you found that when you shift to this new definition of redefining resilience, what is the result of that? Like, what is it? What is life like when you embrace that?
So good, because my history with cancer and autoimmunity and then later mold, a lot of that was autoimmune. If you think metaphorically, and Gabor Mate talks about this, it's the attack of self, right? So if we somehow have parts of ourselves that we feel like, oh my gosh, that, like, I'll tell you my story. My story is, number one, I felt like I was too loud, too vibrant, too much in a very conservative Midwestern family. They were lovely. I had a great family, but it was like, be more quiet. Don't be so loud. Women don't speak. I'm very, very suppressive of that creative, vibrant rebel child that I was. And that's how I was born. But I learned to kind of suppress it, become more like the analytical engineers that the rest of my family was. And in doing that, I suppressed that true nature. And so what it looks like is allowing yourself to be truly who you are without being afraid of what people are going to think. And also just loving those parts of yourself that maybe you got told as a child were not appropriate, were too much, were not enough, were unworthy, or were unlovable. Because those parts all of them are lovable. And when we can start to embrace even the funky, quirky parts of ourselves, we actually become way more interesting people. We're more fun anyway, because all those parts that we kind of thought were, that was a little too much. I think of it as like a dial on a radio. So when you turn up the volume, like the old fashioned dial from 0 to 10, I think I lived most of my life into about my early 40s at maybe a 5 or 6 out of 10. And I never turned up the volume because I thought I'm going to be too much for people. And in the last several years, as I've embraced resilience and learned in this way, I can be a full 10. And yeah, sometimes I'll still blow people out of the water, but I love that energy. And I love that little girl. And I love the one who's like, why can't we do this? What else is possible? Like those ideas. And that's that child that has the ideas and the visions that are way bigger than they think, are even possible. But it brings a joy and authenticity. And everybody has their story. It's not like mine, but we all have a way that we can embrace our full self without apology and not be conditioned to be smaller or be weaker or any of those things. Those just aren't true.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what do you feel like that does for our health? I mean, obviously you have your own journey, but you also see a lot of patients and have this ability to help people kind of turn their health around and have more of this resilience. What does it mean for physical health to then be more resilient?
I think, Trevor, this is the heart and maybe the most important thing that I've learned as far as how do we actually physically become healthy? Because if we have a part of ourselves that we're ashamed of, or we don't like, or we talked briefly before we got on here about how, trauma, childhood abuse, those kinds of things can frame someone's journey. And if we have parts that we haven't dealt with, they're going to act up almost like children and cause problems. And it's interesting, the prototype of breast cancer, again, some of Peter Levine's and Gabor Mate's work talks about this over-nurturing personality, because our breasts are a nurturing organ to the world and to children. And it's almost like a metaphor for that you nurture, you care for, you love people, but you're not taking care of yourself. And so at this core of resilience is, what do you need in a healthy way? How can you supply that and be allowed to ask for that? Because those things actually heal autoimmunity. And those things can be one of the cores of cancer and breast cancers. And it's almost like our cells of our immune system respond very profoundly to our emotions and our mindset and all of that. And I've seen this in my own life, absolutely. As I started to heal these other parts, my immune system started working better and my autoimmunity would go away. And so it really, really does make a difference. So really that embracing of our full selves and trying to find the parts that we maybe haven't dealt with, or that we're afraid of, or that we're ashamed of, and bringing them to the surface and allowing them to play and to be themselves.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, you think about the immune system, it is there to protect us. I think of skin that way too. Skin is our largest organ right on the surface of our bodies. It's there to protect us from the outside world. So a lot of times when I see people with chronic skin issues, they haven't figured out that boundary setting of like, how do you protect yourself? And it's kind of breaking down that barrier. And like with the immune system, it's there. And also it's another form of protecting us. But if we're like on the inside, just breaking ourselves apart, it's like I feel like the immune system gets confused on what its role is.
That's exactly right. Because its job is to protect us from dangerous strangers, but also to be patient enough or get along with our own body and our own cells and our own tissues. A perfect example is when a woman gets pregnant and has a baby. When they're, pregnant with that child, their immune system actually has to tone down a few notches because they don't want to attack this new living being that's separate and different genetic material from themselves. So we see the women's body probably more than any other, especially more than men, go through these transitions of, which is why women have more autoimmunity as well, because we have this swing that's wider than men due to estrogen and lower testosterone in our tolerance of self and non-self. And in that story, basically, if we have either attack of self or self-hatred or self-loathing or parts of ourselves we don't like, metaphorically, it can lead to the immune system being more prone to attack self. But then on the other hand, if we're small or not, robust in those ways and showing up in the world in our true self, we may also not have as much robust activity against outside invaders. And what's interesting about the immune system is we commonly see immune deficiency and autoimmunity in the same person, which is weird, but actually very common. So it can get confused and do one thing on one day and the other thing on the other day and like not be talking cohesively to each other.
Right. So it's definitely more of balancing the immune system rather than boosting the immune system, or right. If we got to find that balance. And so, you have this with your patients, and also in your book, you talk a lot about mold, environmental toxicity, and Lyme disease and things like that. Can you explain a bit about like, how do you help people address these? And what do you see in relationship to resilience with this?
Yeah, so let's talk about mold, biotoxin, illness. So first of all, let's frame functional medicine in a core. I always think of as infectious burden and environmental toxicity, like toxic load. So infectious burden, toxic load come to play, and they tend to be the biggest players in chronic complex illness like autoimmunity or neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, ALS, or even cancers. And so as we think about this interplay, often what happens is we were bit by a tick when we were 12 and we're fine. It's not really bothering us. Or we had chickenpox as a child and we don't have shingles and we're fine. Or we had Epstein-Barr mono when we were in college, but we don't have chronic Epstein-Barr reactivation. So if our immune system is robust and healthy, it keeps those things in check. And we go along, and we all have had past infections that don't bother us. But when we go along and the immune system gets in a weakened state, and one of the big players there is mold and environmental toxicity. So if we have toxins in our environment, I just found out this summer in all of the Colorado water supply, there's PFAOs, which are the Teflon and Gore-Tex kind of Yeah, I know. And it's like all of it's contaminated. There's not one main water source. And this is forever chemicals. The scientists, as I was studying it, they can't even calculate a half-life. They don't even know what the half-life is, which means they're going to be around for decades, if not longer. Like we don't even know. It's probably permanent. That's scary. But all of that, so the water we're drinking, if it's not filtered, we're getting this endocrine disruptor, and it does other things as well. And that's just one of thousands or 10,000s of chemicals. And then like say we're in our home and we don't know it, but there's mold in our wall, that mycotoxin production is an absolute thing that weakens immune system. So all these things, as they weaken our immune system, then those old infections we maybe got, bit by a tick when we were a kid or whatever, will pop up and start to cause problems. So that's kind of how the interplay goes. And with resilience, the first thing that I always say is start very simple with your environment, because that toxic load does make a difference. And I usually just say clean air, clean water, clean food, because it's pretty simple. People get it, meaning try to eat organic, local when possible. You don't have to buy 100% organic, but at least focus on the things that are more likely contaminated with pesticides, because what you're putting into your body is part of that toxic load. And if you can at least eat clean, then you start off with a little bit of a clean slate. And clean water, that'd be, like I said, all the PFAOs in the water supply, so carbon filtration or reverse osmosis or whatever you have in your house or in your fridge, and it doesn't have to be expensive. You can buy a water bottle in your fridge for $20-$30, but you need to be filtering your water and making sure that's clean source, because water's the fuel that we live on, and skin especially so key with hydration. And then so clean air, clean water, clean food. Clean air is we don't think about it, but 80% of our environmental toxic load comes from the air that we breathe. So if we're by a highway or we're getting VOCs, even the wildfires, which we've both been in the areas where and last year was horrendous for air quality for Colorado. And I think it's only going to get worse. And we don't really think about that. We're like, oh, I'm outside, I should be okay. But sometimes the outdoor air was worse than the indoor air. And that air that we're breathing has, we call it 2.5 microns or less particulate. They can literally go right into our alveoli and transfuse into the blood because they're so small. So it's really dangerous, and we aren't even aware of it. So starting with clean air, clean water, clean food, that builds resilience for infections and toxins, because you're doing what you can to lower that toxic load.
Yeah, absolutely. And, and of course I would add skincare, personal care products, and, another big one, because, our skin can be like a sponge for absorbing those things, whatever we put on our skin ends up in our bodies. And, things like fragrance and with the phthalates and all kinds of things that are in personal care products. And also the things that we breathe in, right? Like aerosol spraying things and cleaning products. And there's so many things, but yet I think that a lot of times people will say to me, well, how do I detox? And I'm like, well, you can't detox, you can't cleanse until you start reducing the toxin, because if you're just like continuing to add those in, but I do think then, of course, reducing your exposure and then helping support your body's detoxification pathways, right?
Yeah. The next step, and I just want to stop on skincare because I love that. And I think that's so important, because really after my breast cancer, that was one of my questions. I'm 26, 27, right after 25-year-old breast cancer. And I'm like, why did I get breast cancer? I'm 25 and I actually lived pretty well, healthy. Like I chose good food, I exercised, like I did all the right stuff. And one of the biggest realizations was, oh, I'm putting tons of stuff on I'm not even paying attention. At 25, you don't, right? And I remember going through Bath and Body products and makeup and hair and realizing, oh my gosh, I'm loaded with toxins. So I love that you mentioned that, because one call out to your listeners, which they probably know from listening to you, it's so important what you put on your skin. It's the same as what you put in your mouth as far as how much absorption you can get. So that's really, really key. And then where did you want me to go? Sorry.
The detox pathways. I mean, improving our detoxification pathways, because I think our bodies are absolutely amazing, and that the innate wisdom and the way that we're created in our liver and our kidneys and even our skin, the way we detox, but a lot of times we're just not working optimally.
Yeah. So this is huge, because after you get kind of the clean inputs, then you want to start on actually working on detox. And you mentioned the liver. I always joke, because I went to Switzerland a couple of years for liver detox weeks, and they called the liver the queen. The docs there were like, the liver's the queen. I was like, I like that. I like thinking about, because the liver typically doesn't get a lot of respect, but it is this organ that really, really controls so much of our health. And the whole biotransformation that happens there, we basically take chemicals that are in our skin and tissues, and as they get eliminated through like dry brushing or infrared sauna or rebounding or lymphatic drainage massage or any of these things that kind of start to move the lymph or move the tissues will mobilize those toxins that have been stored. And we all have stored toxins because we're all living in a toxic world, whether it's parabens, phthalates, mycotoxins, et cetera. So as we need to mobilize them first. And again, anything we do to mobilize from lymphatics or sauna, sweating, exercising, we'll start that process, but then we need to take that out of the blood and filter it. And the liver's our filter. So the liver will take the toxins in the blood, take it from phase 1 into an intermediate. The intermediate is actually more toxic than the first thing we start with. So if we get stuck there and we're not processing in phase 2, we can actually get more sick or feel worse. So if you're starting a detox program and you feel worse, you need to support phase 2 of the liver. That's that second part. Second part then takes it into a water-soluble molecule that's excreted in the bile, stored in the gallbladder, and that gallbladder just squeezes it out into the gut. All good, except that the bile acid recirculation, it's called enterohepatic recirculation, is about 95% efficient. So if you don't put in a binder or really work with fibers in your diet to eliminate properly and kind of grab onto these toxins and get them out in the stool, you can just recycle them around and not really eliminate. And it's interesting because our liver does the exact same thing with hormones. Hormones are good. Our body makes them. They're not bad. But if we aren't taking care of that liver pathway, we can even have a toxic load from our own hormones in our body because that's how they're detoxified. So a lot of people with estrogen dominance, breast tenderness, painful periods, fibrocystic breast, fibroids, PCOS, have issues with hormone detox. And that's all about the liver, gallbladder. So supporting that. And then I mentioned earlier some of those things that we usually need to incorporate in moving the toxins, whether it's just exercise or movement, dry brushing, castor oil packs, lymphatic drainage of any type. And then I'm a huge fan of infrared sauna. And I kind of believe, I mean, we can all do a 21-day detox in January, no problem with that. But I'm a much bigger believer in daily habits that encourage detox. So I know I incorporate like sauna at least once a week, sometimes twice a week and more if I can, or dry brushing every time I shower. I usually dry brush before the shower. And talk about skin, which is your area of expertise. That lymphatic system is all about skin, right? If our lymphatic's not working, we get kind of stagnant and we tend to, I used to have terrible acne when I was so toxic. And that was all from the lymphatic and liver.
Yeah. It's so important. And I think that thank you for explaining it that way. That's really helpful to understand how it all works together and that whole process. Is there anything specifically that you do for Lyme or mold or some of these other things that in a way are natural, right? You get a tick bite, like ticks are just out in nature. And I grew up in Virginia and we just pull tick off and just, toss it. Like it was like, just happened all the time. And then, but we didn't have, I guess Lyme is just, it's so much more common. And so do you have any sense, first of all, why it's so much more common than it used to be?
I love this question because often whether it's mold, like, oh, my grandmother had mildew in her shower and we never had any problem, right? Or I like both of those things can be like, well, why now? Why now is it such a big deal? Because it is a big deal. And I feel like there's a couple factors. I think the pandemic shed light on this a little bit because what happened was if this was a really bad virus, granted, and it definitely some people got way more sick than like flu or whatever. So I'm not denying any of that. But what I saw even bigger than that was the result of our environmental toxicity was weakening people in general. So we came into the pandemic in a weaker state because of the toxic load. So in my mind, it's not just the germs. Those are, we need to be careful, whatever. But the other piece of that is what is our immunity and how robust is it? Because if we come into it in a weakened state, then we are much more susceptible to get sick. So same with Lyme or same with mold. If our immune system is, and that's why mold plays into this, because mold is one of those really toxic things to the immune system. In fact, I don't know of much more toxic effects than things like mycophenolic acid, which is from aspergillus and penicillin and some of these molds. And this literally is used to create a drug called Celcept, which is what we give to patients so that they don't reject organ transplants. It's like the most powerful immune suppressive we could give, and it's made from the toxins of mold. So that shows you like how, and that's our super common. When I do urine tests, I see mycophenolic acid from someone getting exposed to mold all the time. Probably 30% of the time, mycophenolic acid. That's like them being on Celcept. So that if you think about a drug to suppress organ rejection, they're going to have viruses or bacteria, things pop up. So number one is our immune systems are in a more weakened state due to our toxic load. Number two is as the populations and suburban areas encroach on open space or forested areas, then all of a sudden we mix with areas that used to be more just deers and mice and ticks. And also we're living in our suburban neighborhood is having, the same population that was there in the middle of the forest is now part of a suburb. And then the other thing with global warming and climate change, we're seeing encroachment of these, and we're seeing migration patterns. And again, I'm not the expert there, but all I can say is now every single state in the US has significant episodes of Lyme. It is no longer relegated to the East Coast and to California, Wisconsin, and Florida. It is all over the place. My state of Colorado is considered a low endemic tick area, but things like tick-borne relapsing fever, which are actually, it's a soft tick that's super common in Texas and Utah and Colorado, Wyoming. And they're often in like maybe log cabins. They can stay there for 15 years and survive. And someone stays in that cabin and either puts a fire or the body heat at night will attract the ticks. Ticks will come out and bite them in the middle of the night. Literally, they can infect the tick-borne relapsing fever soft body ticks within 15 seconds. And there's no rash. So it's like the perfect thing for this tick. And I'm seeing massive amounts of tick-borne relapsing fever. Now, to the average person or the doctor, it looks like Lyme. It acts like Lyme. It's treated like Lyme. So it's very similar to Borrelia from Connecticut and Rhode Island and California. But here in the West, we have it too. And we have different strains. And that is becoming more and more and more common as well. So it's this combination of environmental toxic load, weakened immune system, the changes in our climate, and it really, really is becoming a big issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely something in my 22 years of seeing patients, it's become more of an issue than when I was in medical school. They didn't talk a ton about it in medical school even, but it's become so much more. And so grateful for people like you that specialize in it and know how to treat it. And then also mold is another one where, like you said, it's like, oh, well, it's, and I grew up in a moldy home and my parents were like, oh, it's natural. We live on an organic farm and these things happen, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's just part of nature. But it's also very, very toxic. And so, yeah. Lyme and mold, those are big ones.
They are, sadly. It's funny because maybe 10 years ago, I was like, I'm not going to treat Lyme. I'm not going to treat I say those things. So like, oh, this is so complex. Well, of course you can't help people if you don't, you have to look at their reality. Yeah. But that was years ago. I had said that. I'm like, oh, never say never.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, you know what? I think it's interesting when you talk about the immune system. It is a really complex, and like you said, it's become more complicated because of the environmental toxicity exposures. So I'm curious what you would consider, what is a healthy immune response? Like when somebody has a healthy immune system, what does that look like? Because I feel like we've sometimes forgotten about that, because some people will say to me, oh, I never get sick, so I have a good immune system. But I think that there's a little bit of a myth in that. So what do you think is a sign? What are signs of a healthy immune system?
Oh, that's such a great point, because I have people all the time, and often they're the ones with Lyme or some severe illness, and their immune system has gotten dysfunctionally almost turned off in reaction to a threat. So often, here's what you and I understand this, most listeners probably do since COVID, but maybe they don't. And the important thing is when we have an illness, malaise, fatigue, a little bit of a low grade temp, that's not always the response to a virus, but that is our immune system revving up. And so it's actually the revving up of our cytokines, our internal system to try to fight that. It's not the virus causing that, the virus triggers it, right? But then our immune system starts to rev up a mountain army, mount the immune cells, increase cytokine production, increase inflammation, increase the febrile response. And that is all helpful in fighting the invader, but it's literally our own body's immune system that makes us feel like I'm getting sick. So when someone says, I never get sick, I never feel that, it actually might be a completely suppressed immune response where they're not producing any fighting chemicals or fighting invaders. And it can be more harmful than positive. And what often happens as I help to heal people from Lyme or whatever, at some point in a year or two into the journey, they're like, oh my gosh, I got 2 colds this year. And maybe they got over them quickly, but they had, for example, a fever. That's a good response. If you don't produce fevers at all, or you can't mount a temp above 99, that's a problem with your immune system, because fever is meant to actually suppress viral replication and bacteria. And as long as it's like a low grade and not dangerously high, if I get a fever, I let it go. I mean, it doesn't feel good, but there's a real important response of our immune system in that fever. And I remember, when I did pediatrics and stuff, same thing. As long as it was safe and the kids were comfortable and it wasn't too high and the fever would go down, I would encourage parents to actually let their child have a little bit of a febrile response. Again, as long as there was no dangerous red signs, that is not a bad thing, because we jump to ibuprofen or Tylenol right away to suppress, and we're suppressing our body's ability to fight an infection in some ways. So that's part of the balance. And that's what it looks like, is actually we do have a good response. But say we get sick, have a low grade temp, we recover quickly, we feel better quickly, we kind of go through the cycle. So the curve isn't flat, and the curve isn't like prolonged high fever for a long time. It's kind of like up and down, and then you get well. That's a good immune response.
Thank you for sharing that, because I think there's a myth out there about, our people have been misled for so long by conventional medicine, and also just our general like human innate a tendency of not wanting to feel uncomfortable. And I think of conventional medicine, a lot of times it's about keeping you alive and keeping you comfortable. Yeah. And that it's more about the moment that you're in, and that like that second that you go in to see the doctor, and they're trying to keep you alive and keep you comfortable. Yes. So they're going to give you things with that in mind, but they're oftentimes not thinking about, and I think that this is part of what's ingrained in people, is when I'm uncomfortable, that means something's wrong with my body. And so I appreciate this, but at the same time, there are also people that when they get sick, they get they're super high fever and they stay sick for a really long time. So then there's the other side.
That's the other side, exactly. Yeah. And I actually love, this is full circle to where we started, because what you're describing is how we have been taught to pain is bad, suppress pain at all costs, avoid pain at all costs. And that was my story when I started in med school. It's like, oh, bad, shut it down, don't feel it, don't suppress it. And that could be pain or anger or fear or sadness, anything that's uncomfortable, right? And what you're describing is our culture has said, we don't want to feel pain, we don't want to suffer. And what I was trying to describe in the beginning is, maybe, granted, I don't want you or your listeners to be in pain, I don't want to be in pain, but maybe, just maybe, finding resilience is going through that pain and being okay with it and loving yourself through it, and surrounding yourself by people who care about you. Maybe the actual better resilient answer is actually embracing, what is that here to teach me? And whether it's anger, fear, sadness, or pain, the things that we like to avoid, maybe there's a lesson there. And I think that's where, and I have so much compassion, because I have suffered and I know what it's like. So if you're out there listening and you're suffering, you're like, Jill, you don't know what it's like. Please know I do know what it's like. And I'm not saying that I want you to suffer, but I am saying that maybe, just maybe, there's something there that's going to help you and catapult you to the next level. And your soul actually has a lesson there that will really take you to somewhere that's even more beautiful. So I just want to encourage you, don't be so afraid that you can't look inside that and find meaning and purpose.
Oh, thank you. That's beautiful. And I do think that there's this balance of we don't want to be complacent, right? And just let things happen to us, stay around and be sick. And then at the same time, we don't want to ignore it or run from it, but finding this balance of being aware but then making choices to support our body. And it's really innate wisdom. And so I appreciate all that you do in this. And that's a lot of wisdom and what you've been sharing. And so thank you. And you have a book coming out. And so tell everybody about that, because you've got a lot of wisdom, more wisdom there.
This is the galley. It's going to look like this in hardcover. Super excited. It's called Unexpected: Finding Resilience Through Functional Medicine, Science, and Faith. And in a nutshell, this was quite a journey, because I had always wanted to share my story, but I thought, oh, who am I to write my story? But then as I got in there, I felt stronger and stronger. I really need to frame it. So it goes through a lot of my stories, some of the pieces I've told you, and a lot deeper, and some of the lessons I've learned. But the great thing is we also have all these sidebars that have literally how to heal from toxic mold, how to protect yourself from Lyme disease, like all the kinds of things we've been talking about. The practical tips are in there too. So it's kind of like a 2-in-1. And I really put my heart and soul into it as far as sharing deeply with what I've learned, not only in environmental toxicity, cancer, Crohn's, mold, but also how to go through difficult relationships, ending or beginning, how to find love, how to love yourself, all of these things. And really at the core, it's this resilience. And I say science and faith, and you may have faith in God or not, doesn't matter. matter, but it's almost like the masculine and feminine. And you can think about both those sides. It's almost like, how do we pull these two things together, where we use evidence, we use science, but we also have the belief in the impossible and had the vision of a child and the curiosity of a child. And that's kind of how it's framed, is like, we need both. And it could be feminine, masculine, it could be all of these different parts of ourselves. And so I am super excited to share that.
Awesome. Thank you. I love this, bringing those two sides together, and that dance and that balance. So thank you for all your work, and thank you for your interview today, and tell everybody where they can go to find your book, learn more about you.
Yeah, so if you just go to readunexpected.com, you can get your copy. And we also put together really cool bonuses. They're all free. There's a coloring journal that goes along with the book, so you can color yourself. There's an audio recorded secret chapter and all kinds of things that are on that site. So readunexpected.com.
Awesome. Thank you, Jill.
You're welcome.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Woman's Doctor podcast, be sure to share it with the women in your life and rate and review the show. And to learn all about balancing your hormones, join us for the Hormones, Health, and Harmony 9-part documentary series at hormoneseries.com.